Hello, and welcome back to the third part of the series on dynamic systems theory. So in the second video, we looked at attractors as an important thing that can happen with trajectories. In this third part, we're going to look at the idea of stability, which is a characteristic of attractors. Let's imagine in this bar there are two people, Bill and Carol. And for the last week, both Bill and Carol have been spending a lot of time at the bar, but for different reasons. Carol is going to the bar because they have cable and she wants to watch the World Cup. Bill, on the other hand, also goes to the bar as frequently as Carol, but he just goes because he likes to drink, and he was going before the World Cup and will continue after the World Cup. Now, for both Bill and Carol, we could say that the bar is an attractor state. Insofar as they both keep going back to the bar, that place is an attractor state. So if we were to draw their trajectories on a map of the area where they live, we would see those trajectories regularly going back to the bar. But there's a difference, which is that although going to the bar is an attractor state for both of them, we can say that for Bill it's a more stable attractor state. This is because Bill's habit of going to the bar is not just something that is occurring while the World Cup is on, and only because the World Cup is on, which is the case for Carol. Once the World Cup ends, it's possible that Carol will stop going to the bar. Or if there was a day when there were no World Cup games, Carol would not be at the bar. Bill's habit of going to the bar is more stable because there is not just one condition under which Bill is going to the bar, as there is for Carol. So whereas for Carol, when the World Cup ends, she doesn't go to the bar anymore. For Bill, even events that intervene that would make it more difficult to go to the bar, like financial shortfalls or health problems caused by drinking, even in the face of these, Bill may continue to go to the bar, demonstrating the stability of this behavior. So the various things that can affect or intervene on a situation like going to the bar can be thought of as variables or parameters. So if the behavior of going to the bar is very stable, this means that this attractor state is there across a variety of changes in parameters. So for Bill, for example, Bill is at the bar regardless of whether the World Cup is occurring, regardless of the day of the week or the time of the day, as long as the bar is open, regardless maybe of family or work obligations, regardless of health issues. None of these things are going to stop him from going to the bar. So his behavior is very stable because it occurs across a wide variety of parameters. Unlike Carol's, whose behavior of attending the bar only occurs under very specific conditions. So in this sense, we say it's unstable. All right, so just to sum things up, when we talk about behavior that is stable in the context of dynamic systems theory, we mean something that a person will do under a wide range of conditions, or wide range of different, in technical terms, parameters. So the example of Bill, the alcoholic, always ending up at the bar, regardless of the circumstances. Bill's behavior contrasts with the behavior of Carol, who only went to the bar to watch the World Cup. One important thing that this way of thinking shows is how problems that people face may often be the result of stability in their behavior, not just instability. So if we imagine the fictional Bill, who's constantly going to the bar despite health problems, financial problems, family pressure. From the perspective of Bill's family and other people in his life, he may seem very unstable, but the lack of stability may be actually caused by how incredibly stable his tendency to go to the bar is. Here are some more examples of stable versus unstable behavior. Now, in considering these examples, it's important to remember what I was just saying about the difference between the everyday meaning of the word stable or unstable and the meaning in dynamic systems theory. While they often do overlap, it's important to recognize that many cases where we would say a person is behaving in an unstable way are actually the result of some stable aspect of their behavior, like the example of the alcoholic. So the examples include studying. So studying provides a good example. Sometimes when you're sitting down to study for something, you're very distracted. If someone calls you, you stop studying and talk to them. If something comes up that you want to do, you stop studying and do that. This would indicate that the behavior is very unstable. So we can think about this in terms of the idea of a trajectory, where studying, the activity of studying, continuing to focus on what you're studying, would be one particular location on the graph or coordinate plane. And to the extent that the activity of studying is unstable or is a weak attractor, we could say that the trajectory, although it may tend to go to the studying location, will have a high tendency to leave that location when any number of things changes. On the other hand, a very dedicated, committed student studying for something, we would expect them to be, in their studying behavior, more stable. They're ignoring distractions, other things happening don't get them off task. They keep studying, even as the conditions in which they're studying change. So again, to use more language from dynamic systems theory, we could say that for the dedicated student, studying is a stronger attractor state, and that this dedicated student tends to remain in this state even as various parameters change. So the parameters could be, various distractions that are present or are not present. As they become present, still the studying behavior is not disrupted. So I want to return now to this example from before. So if you remember, this is the case of using motion tracking technology to record a person's movements as they walk on a treadmill. And if you take the raw data collected in that way, you can derive out things like the angle of either thigh, their left thigh angle and their right thigh angle. And if you have them walk on a treadmill and then graph the trajectory of movements of each thigh, what you see as they walk is this roughly repeating pattern, reflecting the cyclical pattern of changing thigh angles from a person walking. This is an example of an attractor we can see here. The attractor being the approximately repeating pattern I'm highlighting right now. Now, of course, the person as they walk, they don't perfectly repeat their movements with each step, but the movements do roughly repeat. And what I had just traced is what we can say is the attractor state. As the person is trying to walk to get around in the environment, they tend to go towards that sort of a pattern, at least in terms of the changing angles of their thighs. So for the sake of illustration, let's take this pattern here to just exemplify the distinctive pattern of movement seen with walking. Walking, we could say, is for most adults a stable attractor state. It's a stable pattern of movement when we're trying to get around an environment. But again, to build off of what I've said so far, when we say that something is an attractor state, it means that it's stable, not typically universally so, but stable across some range of parameters. Or in other words, stable across some range of different conditions. So to illustrate what I mean, consider that I want to go over across the room and turn off the light. Now, before getting into this example, one thing that I just want to note is that in any given situation, there are often multiple simultaneous or overlapping attractors that we can identify in our behavior. So, for example, in the last video where I introduced attractors, I showed how a particular place that a person goes, like a person's apartment, that point in space could be an attractor. But we could also treat as an attractor a pattern of movement around space. Similarly, in the case of my deciding to go across the room to turn off the light, we could say that the light itself as the destination, a point in space, is an attractor, like my apartment was in the other example. But we can also treat repeating cyclical patterns over time as attractors. So this could be a particular route that a person tends to repeatedly follow through the environment. Or, as I show in the upcoming example, it could be a specific pattern within a person's movement around the environment, like the repeating pattern of your legs as you walk. So, I'm going to cross the room. How am I going to get there? Am I going to crawl there? Am I going to run there? Am I going to skip there? I could do any of those. Those are all possible ways I could move across the room. Crawling, running, skipping, rolling. But in this situation, what I would do would be to get up and walk across the room. Turn off the light. And then walk back across the room to come back to the computer. Now, walking across the room, as I just did, provides another way to illustrate the idea of stability and of attractor states, and of stronger or weaker attractor states. So in the particular case that I just illustrated, I walked across the room. But that pattern of walking wouldn't just come up in that one instance. Instead, it would come up across a wider range of parameters. What I mean by this is there are many characteristics of this particular situation I'm in. There's the weight of the clothing that I'm wearing, there's my height, there's the amount of muscular strength that I have or am lacking, there's the slipperiness or the roughness of the floor, there's the height of the ceiling. I could go on and on with characteristics of the situation. When I needed to go over and turn off the light, walking emerged as the regular pattern of movement that I used to get over there. So we could say that walking is stable as opposed to crawling, jumping, rolling, etc. Walking is stable, or is a stronger attractor, insofar as we could vary the conditions in the room in a variety of ways, and I would still have walked to go and turn off the light. Now, it's true that it would have been possible that I, under certain circumstances, might have crawled across the room or skipped across the room, but those would have been much more rare. The conditions required, the conditions under which that would have happened as opposed to walking, would have been very specific, few in number. Whereas, for example, if I had a backpack on my back, I would still walk. If my shirt was heavier, I would still walk. If my legs were a little bit weaker, I would still walk. If my legs were a little bit stronger, I would still walk. But even with the most stable forms of behavior, there are always going to be parameters or characteristics of the system, or the situation, that when we change them will lead the otherwise very stable behavioral pattern to change, to become unstable. Imagine that I'm standing here on a treadmill, and the treadmill is stopped, and I turn it on, but I turn it on to the lowest speed. Let's say it's 0.01 miles an hour. So the treadmill begins to move. And let's imagine every couple of seconds I turn it up to a slightly higher speed. So very gradually the speed of the treadmill is increasing. Now, when I wanted to go across the room before, I walked. Now I'm on a treadmill, moving at 0.01 miles an hour. Am I also going to walk? I don't think so. At 0.01 miles an hour, walking would be incredibly uncomfortable. I could walk, but because the treadmill is moving so slowly, I would have to be kind of hovering in the air, waiting for it to move enough that I could lean forward and take a step. The more natural thing that would happen would be on the very slowly moving treadmill that I would start at the front and slowly ride it back without moving, with the treadmill moving me. And then when I got near the end, to just take a step and walk to the front and then ride it back again. This is a pattern of movement, an attractor state that would repeat just as walking would repeat if I was going at a higher speed. But at a very low speed, the pattern of walking to the front of the treadmill and riding it back, waiting to get to the end, and then repeating, that would be a stable pattern of movement across some range of speeds. So from 0.01 until 1 mile an hour, I guess I could be wrong. That would be the natural, comfortable way to move. I could move in other ways, but the most stable pattern of movement would be this walking to the front and riding to the back. Then as the speed increases, eventually I'll get to a point where walking will no longer be the most stable attractor state. I'll get to a point where this walking to the front and then riding back will no longer be the most stable attractor state. Instead, walking will become more stable. It will become more natural to walk. So I could guess maybe this would be from like 1 or 2 miles an hour up until 5 or 6 miles an hour. Within that range of speeds, walking would be the natural pattern that emerges. And we could say it's an attractor state. If I'm going 5 miles an hour, I would walk even if I had a backpack on or without the backpack on, in some amount of wind or in less wind. I would still walk. So walking would be the stable, strong attractor state for moving at 4 miles an hour. But let's say that the speed of the treadmill keeps increasing. At a certain point, walking is going to cease to be stable. I guess maybe 7 or 8 miles an hour or so. Again, just a guess. I could be wrong about this. But at a certain speed, walking for a person of my height, my strength, the wind conditions, and so forth, walking would cease to be the strongest attractor state. A new pattern would emerge, jogging or running. So at a certain speed, I would shift as the previous attractor state became less strong and a new one emerged. So I would switch to jogging. Of course, I could try to walk faster. I could try to walk at 8 miles an hour. Maybe I could. It would just be very uncomfortable. Just as I could try to I could try to crawl to the train station. It would just be very uncomfortable. We walk or we crawl or we jog across some range of parameters. Once we exceed that range, what was previously within the range, a stable pattern of behavior, the strongest attractor state, ceases to be the strongest attractor state, and a new one emerges. So some of these ideas here are incomplete before we get to the next video, but this idea of attractor states and certain forms of behavior being stable or stronger attractor states within some range of parameters provides an incredibly powerful way to understand development. Consider the process of a child learning to walk. Maybe around 1 year old, a child who's 12 months old will first experiment with walking, but having to hold themselves onto the walls or onto other objects as they're walking. And only under certain conditions, very narrow range of conditions, will the infant attempt to walk. The infant's not going to attempt to walk on sand. They're not going to attempt to walk on gravel. They're not going to attempt to walk in the wind, on a slope. only under a very narrow range of conditions will walking occur. And even then, it's not a stable pattern. They'll fall over or they'll switch to crawling. They'll only walk. Another important example of stability here. The infant who is beginning to walk will only do so not just in certain physical conditions, but in certain psychological conditions. If someone who they're very excited to see comes in and they want to get over to them, they're probably not going to walk. They're going to crawl because it's much faster. They'll only walk when they're in a sort of exploratory situation where there's no pressing needs on them at that moment. Now, how does walking develop, or how does the infant develop from crawling to walking? Well, using the framework that we've been talking about here, we can explain a lot of it. Rather than just saying that the child learns to walk and becomes better at walking, not that that's not true, it is, but we can say that walking first emerges, but is not a stable attractor. It's a very unstable, weak attractor. It's a rare form of behavior that only occurs under certain conditions. And as the child comes to walk more and more, instead of saying they're getting better at it, we can say that walking becomes a stronger attractor state. And it's stable across an increasingly broad range of conditions. Or in other words, the parameters within which walking is the strongest or a strong attractor state as a way to move around become broader and broader and broader until we get to the place of the most normal adults where walking is across a wide range of parameters, the default attractor state that emerges when the person wants to move around the environment. So that's all for this video. In the next video, we'll build on these ideas, but look at them in the context of more mental processes and brain processes.